I mentioned to you that this is a case involving what is referred to as preemptive fitness for duty evaluations. You may recall me telling you that the ADA requires as a threshold for a compulsory evaluation, medical examination of a incumbent employee, requires that there be, you recall, objective evidence of impaired performance with a reasonable basis for believing that there is an underlying medical condition that is responsible for or contributing to or underlying that impairment, or a direct threat as a result of a medical condition. But what about an employee whose behavior is exhibiting an objective basis for concern that they may at some point be unable to safely or effectively perform the duties of their job? But right now, there's no evidence of, there's no objective evidence of impaired performance. What do we do there? Do we have to wait until there's impaired performance in a police officer? Well, this is the case in Brownfield versus City of Yakima, Washington, Eastern Washington City. Brownfield is a police officer who's working in the PAL unit. And Brownfield is getting really pissy with a fellow officer and is making a lot of accusations about his coworker, even is implying at one point that he may be stealing PAL funds and using them for his own purposes. And he writes a lot of memoranda complaining about this guy, and he's raising a lot of fuss. And he's showing problems in his marriage, an accusation of domestic violence, although charges are never formally filed. He has a meeting with his sergeant in which he abruptly shouts an expletive, says, "I gotta get out of here." He walks out, goes into another room talking to a police officer, fellow police officer, demanding that he have union representation. The sergeant walks in the room and says, "Hey, chill, get back in the room. We're not done with our conversation." He blows up at him and starts, saying that, I don't even care how this is going to end. This is totally out of control. He starts making implications that there might be some kind of violence that may be following. They're worried about this guy. But his performance on the job has not yet been problematic. So they refer him to a psychiatrist. Some of you may have heard of Dr. Decker. She has written a book called Fit, Unfit, or Misfit. And so she does the evaluation. He had several years earlier a traumatic brain injury and had returned to work thereafter. She diagnosed him with a mood disorder resulting from a general medical condition, found him to be permanently unfit for duty. So they have a Loudermill hearing to let him know that they're going to be letting him go. In the meanwhile, he meets with Dr. Marr. Some of you may know him. He used to be in Dan Clark's place at the Washington State Patrol, psychologist. He does a independent fitness for duty evaluation, and he agrees that he's unfit for duty, but believes that fitness can be restored with treatment. So now we've got agreement that he's unfit, but a difference of opinion as to whether or not he should be cut loose. So they now decide that they're going to have a third examination, this one by Dr. Ekimo in the Seattle area, and send him to Dr. Ekimo. Dr. Ekimo sees him once. He's going to see him again, but he decides he's not going to show up for that next evaluation. So that evaluation isn't completed, and they decide to fire him. So Brownfield goes to court to stop this and say they shouldn't have had the fitness for duty evaluation in the first place, even the first one from Dr. Decker, because he never met the ADA threshold in the absence of any objective evidence of impaired performance. So here's what the Ninth Circuit Court said. First, we hold that the business necessity standard, recall that that is the crux of the threshold. We hold that the business necessity standard may be met even before an employee's work performance declines if the employer is faced with significant evidence that could cause a reasonable person to inquire as to whether an employee is still capable of performing his job. An employee's behavior cannot be merely annoying or inefficient to justify an examination. Now, do you recall hearing that yesterday?
Yes.
Sullivan.
Yeah.
That was a Sullivan case. So they borrowed from a, I believe, First Circuit case. And this is one of the reasons why, as you follow case law, why it's important to not just ignore a circuit decision that falls outside of your circuit. Because these are compelling analyses that often are adopted by other courts. So here's the Ninth Circuit adopting the language of the First Circuit. Rather, there must be genuine reason to doubt whether that employee can perform job-related functions. Now, the court goes on to say that the ADA, quote, prohibits employers from using medical exams as a pretext to harass employees or to fish for non-work related medical issues. Now that's important to remember. We talked about that yesterday, that there's a narrow scope in an evaluation. You can't simply go fishing for any underlying mental health condition. It has to be relevant to the behavior at issue. Or to fish for non-work related medical issues and the attendant unwanted exposure of the employee's disability and the stigma it may carry. Many of the court cases, some of which we'll talk about in a few minutes, where the courts have found that the compulsory examination was unlawful, is tied to, or these decisions have been tied to the fact that compulsory examinations of employees create a stigma. Just the requirement alone can create a stigma. Not to mention the potential for deprivation of property rights, the loss of a job. So the courts tend to be protective of avoiding that stigma for employees, while at the same time giving deference to an employer's interest in protecting the ability of the employees to do the job, particularly when public safety is involved. So let's talk about that, because that latter comment I just made is really the foundation of Brownfield. The court went on to say, our consideration of the fitness for duty examination's legitimacy is heavily colored by the nature of Brownfield's employment. Police officers are likely to encounter extremely stressful and dangerous situations during the course of their work. When a police department has good reason, underscore good reason, goes back to that pre-referral conference, good reason to doubt an officer's ability to respond to these situations in an appropriate manner, an FFDE is consistent with the ADA. Yes, Rand.
Would this be an example of an officer who shows a temper problem during SWAT training, just during the training, yelling, slamming doors, trying to lose his temper, but no citizens' complaints, great evaluations?
Yes, so the question is, would this be an example of a police officer, or might this correspond with the example of a police officer who during SWAT training shows uncontrolled emotionality, temper control, loss of temper control, but in the performance of his duties is non-problematic?
Right.
Yes.
Good, because I have none of those.
There you go. There you go.
A reasonable person meaning police standard reasonable, or this is locker room everyday stuff.
Yeah, no, it's a reasonable person in the context in which it occurs. Yeah, it has to be not.
Under the standard of police norm.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, but that's exactly right. It would be inappropriate in a psychology office to pat your associate on the ass as you walk by, but in the NFL, it's normal. So you do have to evaluate these behaviors in context.
So the example that was the origin of the question, in the context that some agencies might be expected behavior when somebody's upset.
It may be expected behavior. In a blue-collar environment, for example, I consult with a number of cities in workplace violence issues in developing workplace response teams. And in one of the cities I consult for, I encourage them to have a zero-tolerance policy with respect to violence, or even exceedingly aggressive behavior. And they say, well, that'd be fine to do in all of the departments except public works. Because these guys, you know how blue-collar guys are, you know, they take it outside, jerkwad. You know, that's a slippery slope when you start allowing that kind of aggressive behavior to take place but it is the reality of the workplace is that you have to look at the context in which behavior occurs and the subcultures surrounding those behaviors. But even assuming, Rand, that even, and presumably, even the witnesses to that regarded it as problematic.
Exactly, and also had given the employees some feedback and they're looking to change.
Precisely. And that's one of the first questions you ask is, has anybody told him to knock it off? Yeah, we did. And is he able to? No. Well, so that's the first indicator of a problem, is that they have no boundary control. They can't stop when they're told to stop.
We had perfectly normal testing.
Perfectly normal testing?
Yeah.
What a surprise.